The soil above Ezra Marsh's grave was still fresh when his life's work was divided at a kitchen table in the Nebraska Sandhills in the autumn of 1889. The reading of the will took less than 10 minutes, and every sentence tilted in the same direction. Wendell Marsh, the elder son, received the frame house with its cedar shingles, the deep sod-lined well that never ran dry, the 60 head of cattle grazing along the Loup River bottom, and every acre of tillable ground his father had spent 32 years wrestling from prairie grass. Across the table sat Jonah Marsh, his wife Clara, their 7-year-old boy Thomas, and a shaggy black and tan dog named Ranger, who kept his chin resting on the boy's boot. When the county lawyer finished reading, Jonah's inheritance came to a single line at the bottom of the page. A lame draft horse, a wagon with a split tongue, 40 acres of alkali flat north of the Buffalo Wallow, and precisely $18 in mixed coin. Wendell counted out the money himself. He slid the coins across the pine boards with 2 fingers, the way a man might push away food he did not care to eat. A small, tight smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "A steak for a dreamer," he said. Nothing more. Thomas looked up at his mother. "Are we not staying with Uncle Wendell?" Clara did not answer. She rested her hand on the boy's shoulder and pressed once. Gently, Jonah said nothing at all. He did not argue the will. He did not ask the lawyer to read the clauses a second time. He simply gathered the coins into his palm, took his father's cracked leather almanac from the shelf above the stove, and stood. He did not look at his brother. He did not look at the warm cast-iron range or the walnut clock ticking against the wall. He looked instead through the north window, out past the barn and the windbreak of cottonwoods, toward the empty horizon where the October sky was already turning the color of pewter. $18 in his pocket, a wagon that could not carry a full load, a patch of ground the neighbors called worthless, and winter, in that part of Nebraska, was 6 weeks away at the outside. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge, the wagon rolled away from the Marsh homestead for the last time. The land waiting for them beyond the Buffalo Wallow looked like a place the prairie itself had given up on. Pale, crusted soil stretched in every direction, streaked with white where old salts had risen through drought. A few clumps of yucca clung to a low rise. A hawk circled once and drifted away, as though even it had found nothing worth staying for. There was no house, no dugout, no barn, no fence, and no visible sign that water lay anywhere beneath the surface. The old draft horse strained against the harness as the wheels dragged across the hardpan. From the seat of the wagon, Clara could still see her father-in-law's homestead in the distance. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney. The cattle moved in slow lines toward the river. Everything Ezra Marsh had spent a lifetime building now belonged to another man's hands. Jonah climbed down and walked a slow circle around the claim. His boots scuffed up small clouds of pale dust. Thomas stood beside the wagon, his fingers buried in Ranger's coat. "Are we going back, Pa?" Jonah looked toward the distant farmhouse. Then he looked at the ground beneath him. "No," he said. "We build here." The problem announced itself before Jonah Marsh had driven a single stake into the alkali ground. The nearest town, a scatter of frame buildings called Willow Bend, sat 9 miles south along the wagon road. By noon of that first day, Jonah stood inside Alden Farrow's mercantile while the storekeeper worked a pencil across a sheet of butcher paper. Cut lumber, penny nails, tar paper, a length of stovepipe, a small window sash if one could be found used. The figures climbed steadily down the page. A cabin large enough for a family of 3, built to shed a Nebraska winter, would cost somewhere near $140, and that was before a stove. Jonah had 18. Alden set down the pencil and turned the paper so his customer could read it. Neither man spoke for a while. The arithmetic had settled the matter without help from either of them. Back at the claim, another plan died just as quickly. A shallow depression near the Buffalo Wallow suggested moisture might be found close to the surface. Jonah spent most of an afternoon working a spade through crusted soil. 2 feet down, he struck a layer of hard caliche that turned the blade. 3 feet down, the sides of the hole began to slough. By evening, the pit had filled halfway with its own collapsed walls. The next attempt involved sod. A patch of ground near a dry creek bed showed a mat of buffalo grass that looked promising. The first cut lifted cleanly. The second broke apart in his hands. The roots were too dry, the soil too loose. What Jonah needed was thick spring sod, and spring was 5 months gone. Fuel offered no consolation. Clara gathered dried cow chips from an old cattle trail. Thomas hauled back small bundles of sage and yucca stalks. Ranger, in his own way, contributed a length of rotted fence rail almost as tall as the boy, and seemed enormously pleased about it. Jonah stacked the meager pile beside the wagon and looked at it for a long time. It would burn for perhaps 3 nights if the weather stayed mild. The weather would not stay mild. 2 days into that first week, a visitor arrived. Otis Blackwell, a builder from Willow Bend who had raised barns and homes across 4 counties, reined up beside the wagon and sat his horse in silence for several minutes. His eyes moved across the empty ground, the broken tongue of the wagon, the tired horse, the boy and the dog. He climbed down at last and walked the perimeter of the claim without asking permission. "A family cabin," he said finally, "needs a stone footing, milled studs, tar paper on the sheathing, and a roof pitched steep enough that snow slides instead of settles. Anything less than that, and February in this country will kill a child in his sleep." Jonah listened without interrupting. Otis named a figure. It was not unreasonable. It was simply impossible. The builder took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "Sell the claim," he said. "Wendell will buy it for a song, and you'll winter in town. Come spring, hire out, save your wages, try again." The advice was offered kindly, without contempt. Ranger settled beside Thomas and pressed his warm flank against the boy's leg. Otis noticed. "A boy," he said, quieter now, "does not know about pride when the cold gets in. He can be right in every argument he ever made and still lose that child before sunrise." Jonah's face did not change. But long after Otis Blackwell had ridden south, those words remained inside the wagon like a second passenger. The next journey took Jonah Marsh back to the place he no longer had a right to call home. The autumn light lay soft across the pastures as he crossed the last rise. Cattle moved along the river bottom. A pair of hired men worked at repairing a corral gate near the barn. Smoke rose in a straight column from the chimney of the frame house. From that distance, nothing about the farm had changed, only the name on the deed. Jonah stopped the wagon near the grain shed and climbed down. Wendell was standing in the yard, giving instructions to one of the hands. He turned when he heard the wheels stop, and his expression shifted through several small movements before settling into something familiar. "I've come to buy hay," Jonah said. "Or straw. Whatever you can spare. I have money for it." He held out a portion of the coins in his palm. Wendell looked at the offered money, then at his brother's face, and a low laugh escaped him. "The hay belongs to me," he said. His arms swept in a wide, easy arc that took in the barn, the corrals, the stacks in the field, the cattle beyond them. All of it. Every stem. "If you want to feed something this winter, you should have thought of that before you signed the papers." The hired men had stopped working. Their hammers hung idle. Neither looked directly at the brothers, but neither missed a word. "You still believe you can outbuild the weather," Wendell continued. "Father spent the last 10 years of his life bailing you out of one bad idea after another. He was patient with you long past the point where patience did any good." The words carried on the still air. Somewhere near the barn, a horse blew softly through its nose. Wendell walked past his brother and kicked at a pile of weathered hay bundles stacked behind the shed. Most had gone dark with moisture along the bottoms. Several had split open where the twine had rotted through. A few were speckled with mildew where rain had reached them. "That," Wendell said, pointing, "that's what a man in your position gets. Fitting for a beggar. Take it and go, or leave it and go. Makes no difference to me." Near the wagon, Thomas watched everything without moving. Clara kept her eyes fixed on some point beyond the barn. Ranger's shoulders had risen, and a low sound was moving in his throat that had not been there a moment before. Jonah did not answer his brother. He did not argue about the will, or their father, or the years of quiet effort no one had ever counted. He simply walked to the pile of discarded bales, bent down, and picked one up. He carried it to the wagon and set it on the boards. Then he went back for another. "Build your dream with mildew," Wendell called after him. "See how it holds together." One bale at a time, Jonah loaded the wagon. The hired men eventually returned to their work, though more slowly than before. By the time the wagon bed was full, the laughter from the yard had thinned to nothing. The weight added by all those bales was almost negligible. The old horse hardly noticed the difference. Yet when Jonah placed the last one beside his father's leather almanac on the seat, something about the arrangement felt heavier than it should have. He climbed up, took the reins, and turned the wagon north without a word. Darkness settled over the alkali flat long before Jonah Marsh thought about sleep. With no walls yet standing and no dugout scraped from the earth, the family made their nights inside the wagon. A canvas half-cover shielded them from the wind on one side. A single kerosene lantern burned low on an overturned crate. Thomas slept curled against Clara beneath the heaviest of the blankets, and Ranger lay across the boy's feet with his ears twitching at every distant sound the prairie made. Jonah sat on the wagon's tailboard with his father's leather almanac open across his knees. Page after page carried Ezra Marsh's careful pencil marks. Rainfall by the month. First frost dates going back to 1863. Notes on which springs held through drought and which failed. The temperature every January morning for a decade. Observations about the way certain grasses cured and how deep the snow drifted along the fence line during the winter of the deep cold. One line had been written more than once, in different years and different inks. "Wind takes what it can reach." Jonah read it again. Then his eyes drifted toward the pile of moldy hay bundles Wendell had thrown aside. The bales sat beside the wagon in the moonlight, pale and rounded, catching the light along their upper surfaces. Something about them refused to leave him alone. A memory rose without being called. He was perhaps 8 years old, and his father had taken him into the loft of the old barn during a January storm. The wind had been screaming across the roof shingles, and the barn boards had rattled in their frames. Yet deep among the stacked hay, in a small hollow his father had made him crawl into, the sound of the storm had grown distant, and the cold had seemed to belong to another country. He had fallen asleep there, while his father worked below, and he had not shivered once. Jonah reached down beside the tailboard and pulled a stem from one of the bales. He held it up to the lantern light. The stalk snapped cleanly between his fingers. Its center was hollow. He pulled another. The same. Another still. Tiny chambers, tiny pockets of trapped air, running the length of every stem. He rolled a piece of straw between his thumb and forefinger. A hay mattress could keep a sleeping body warmer than a plank floor. A loft packed to the rafters could hold the day's warmth long after sunset. A haystack in the field could keep unfrozen cattle alive through a January that killed penned animals in barns. The idea was not new. It had simply never been asked to do what he was now considering asking it to do. Not excitement. Something quieter than excitement. A possibility, tested against the arithmetic of $18 and 40 acres of alkali. Across the wagon, Clara shifted beneath her blanket. She had been watching him without speaking. "Are you thinking of walls?" she asked. Jonah did not look up from the hollow stem in his hand. His voice, when it came, was low. "I'm thinking of what the wind cannot reach." Clara studied him for a long moment. She did not answer right away. She looked at her sleeping son, and at the dog, and at the pile of discarded bales that Wendell had thrown at their feet as an insult. Then she looked back at her husband. "Then think hard," she said finally, "and think all the way through." Jonah lowered the almanac and closed it gently. Morning arrived without miracles. The bales still sat beside the wagon. The alkali flat still stretched pale and unpromising to the horizon. The wind had not moved further away in the night, yet something in the shape of the day had changed. After a spare breakfast of cornmeal and coffee, Jonah knelt on a patch of bare ground and began scratching lines in the dirt with a piece of yucca stalk. Clara stood behind him with her arms folded, watching the shapes take form. Thomas sat cross-legged with Ranger beside him, both of them serious as jurors. 16 feet by 12, Jonah said, drawing a rectangle. Enough for a bed against that wall, a stove there, a plank table, a bench, a corner for the boy and the dog. Space for a second bed if the boy grows out of the corner. He drew thicker lines around the outside of the rectangle. Then, thicker lines still. Walls, Clara said, not a question. She was measuring the depth of the marks in the dust. Thick ones, Jonah answered. 2 bales deep at the base. 1 bale deep from about waist height upward. Laid on their broadsides, not standing on end. Every second course turned so the joints between bales do not line up. Split cedar stakes driven vertically through 3 courses at a time to bind them together. Rawhide loops at the corners to keep the courses from sliding under load. A stone footing running the whole way around, above the frost line so nothing wicks damp up into the straw. He kept drawing. Clara kept watching. Outside surface plastered heavy, Jonah continued. Not a thin skin, a shell. Clay from the creek bank mixed with fine sand from the wash, wood ash from the stove, chopped hay tied into the mix for tensile strength. 3 coats. Each coat rougher than the one above it, so the next one keys into it. Inside, the same treatment, thinner, a roof of cottonwood poles with sod above canvas, above straw, pitched enough to shed water, but not so steep the sod slides off in a wet spring. The drawing in the dust looked strange even to him. It did not resemble any cabin that had been raised in Nebraska. It did not resemble the neat frame houses of Willow Bend, nor the dugouts along the river, nor the soddies scattered across the sandhills. It was its own thing. Clara studied the sketch a long time. She was a practical woman, and she did not spend her words carelessly. When she finally spoke, she asked the only question that mattered. Will it stand? Jonah looked toward the wagon, then at the broken chunks of sod he had failed to cut, then at the coin still folded into his handkerchief. Finally, at the pile of bales. I don't know, he said. I know the wagon will not keep us alive. I know the sod will not hold together for me. I know we cannot buy lumber. If the hay is nothing but trash, then the trash is the only thing we have enough of to try. Clara stood in silence. A weak breeze moved across the flat. Thomas raised his hand as though he were in a schoolhouse. Does Ranger sleep inside too? He asked. Jonah's face softened for the first time in weeks. A small crooked smile lifted one side of his mouth. Ranger, he said, may be the first among us to know whether it's working. The dog raised his head at the sound of his name. Clara looked at the drawing once more. Then she nodded. Show me where to start. The work began the following morning, and it did not stop until the light gave out each evening. Jonah Marsh set aside the question of whether the plan would succeed and turned his attention to the smaller, more manageable question of what needed to be done next. That, at least, had answers. Some of the hay came from the moldy pile Wendell had thrown at his feet. More came from ranches scattered across the county, where old bales lay forgotten behind sheds and along fence lines, gone gray from a summer in the sun. A few landowners handed them over freely. Others accepted labor and trade. Jonah spent an afternoon mending a windmill for a widow near Willow Bend, and another repairing a corral fence for a homesteader whose sons had gone east for the season. Each job ended with the wagon rolling home under a fresh load of bales, and Jonah Bone tired on the seat. Cedar came from a draw 7 miles west that no one had bothered to claim. He cut the limbs by hand and split them into stakes beside the wagon in the evenings. Clara worked the rawhide, cutting narrow strips from a pair of old hides she had traded a mended coat for at the mercantile. She mixed the first batches of plaster in a hollowed section of the wagon bed, testing proportions of clay and sand and ash until the mixture would hold together in her fist without crumbling. Thomas gathered chopped grass and stacked cedar shavings and carried water from a seep Jonah had located a quarter-mile east. Ranger, in the way of a working dog with no clear assignment, made himself part of the crew by dragging in whatever strange objects he found: a frayed length of manila rope, a leather glove missing 3 fingers, a short section of iron barrel hoop no one had thought about in years. Some of it turned out to be useful. All of it made Thomas laugh. The strange project drew notice. News traveled fast across that country. Jonah Marsh was building a house out of hay. The reactions arrived just as fast. A cattleman claimed the walls would be eaten to the ground by his own stock inside a month. Another swore the first hard Chinook would scatter the whole business across 3 counties. A schoolteacher in Willow Bend was heard to say she had never in her life met a man foolish enough to build his family a bed of tinder. Wendell seemed to enjoy the story most of all. Beggar's Barn, he called it, and the name spread. By the end of the second week, men at Alden Farrow's Mercantile were using it without smiling, as though it were simply the structure's proper name. Alden himself extended a small line of credit for tar paper scraps, penny nails, and a used length of stovepipe. He did not mock Jonah to his face. His expression, when he added the items to his ledger, was the practiced calm of a man watching a bad hand play itself out. The walls rose in courses, one layer of bales, then another. Joints staggered. Cedar stakes driven down from above, rawhide loops drawn snug at the corners. The structure grew taller. It did not grow prettier. It grew instead thicker and more certain of itself. A few weeks in, Otis Blackwell rode out to look. He said nothing for a long time. He set both hands against the north wall and pushed hard. The wall did not shift. He pushed again with his shoulder behind it. Nothing moved. He stepped back and brushed dust from his hands. Standing in October, he said, is not the same as standing in January. Then he mounted and rode away. For a while, the cabin seemed to justify every stubborn choice Jonah Marsh had made. The bale walls climbed to their full height without sagging. The rawhide loops at the corners held. The cedar stakes drove home without splitting the bales they passed through. The first coat of plaster clung to the surface as though it had been designed for it. Clara stepped back one afternoon and looked at what they had made, and for the first time since the reading of the will, she allowed herself a small, cautious hope. Then autumn reminded them that an idea could survive theory and still fail in practice. A cold rain moved across the flat one afternoon in late October. It was not a dramatic storm. It came in sideways on a north wind for perhaps 2 hours, and then it moved on. The real damage revealed itself the following morning. Jonah stepped outside at first light and stopped where he stood. Thin cracks had opened across a broad section of the north plaster, some no wider than a hair, others long enough to run his thumb along. Near the lower corner, the clay had pulled entirely away from the bale beneath it, exposing a patch of pale straw the size of a saucer. That alone would have been trouble enough. The next thing he noticed was worse. A dark line of moisture ran along the base of the wall where rainwater had puddled against the foundation stones. The water had lingered exactly where it should not have. Jonah crouched and pressed his palm against the lowest course of plaster. It came away damp. A sharp bark cut through his thinking. Ranger stood at the northeast corner, scratching furiously at the ground. The dog dug at the base of the wall with quick, urgent motions and barked again. Jonah crossed to him and knelt down. A small section of loose material pulled free in his hand. Beneath it, tiny, neat bite marks ran through several strands of exposed hay. A single black seed of droppings sat among them. Mice. The problem doubled in size in an instant. Moisture could rot the bales from within. Rodents could tunnel through them and make a nest of the walls themselves. Both together could unmake in a month what he had spent 6 weeks building. Otis Blackwell's warning about January arrived again, louder than before. Jonah did not spend the day defending the design. He spent it changing it. By mid-morning, a shallow trench filled with gravel ran the full circuit of the cabin, angled to carry rainwater away from the base. Stones from the dry creek bed formed a low protective skirt against the foundation, keeping mud from splashing up onto the plaster. Jonah reworked the plaster mixture entirely. More sand for stability, more wood ash, which the old-timers said discouraged both mice and mildew, more chopped hay bound into the mud for tensile strength. He cut fresh rawhide strips and sealed every gap he could find along the sill line. Clara traded a mended winter coat that afternoon to Otis Blackwell's wife, Miriam, in exchange for a full sack of hardwood ash from her stove and several coils of old rawhide the family had set aside. Not charity, a fair exchange, entered into as equals. That evening, Clara set the sack of ash beside Jonah's work. Miriam wouldn't take thanks, she said. She said a well-sewn seam is worth more than pity. Jonah looked at the ash, then at the wall, then picked up his trowel again. The cabin was no longer only an idea. It was becoming a teacher, and the lessons were being paid for. The repairs solved one set of problems and did nothing to solve another. Building materials cost money. Fuel cost money. Flour, salt, coffee, and the small tin of matches Clara guarded, like communion silver, all cost money that Jonah Marsh no longer had. A few days after the plaster repairs, he drove the wagon south to Willow Bend with a short list and a lighter handkerchief than he cared to think about. Inside the mercantile, the purchase was modest. A handful of nails, a small sack of flour, a paper of salt, a used length of stovepipe with enough rust along one seam to suggest it had heated 3 houses before this one. Alden Farrow gathered the items on the counter and opened his ledger. The debt was not large. That, somehow, made it worse. Small debts had a way of quietly becoming larger ones. Alden ran a finger down the page. Then, he looked up over his spectacles. Your brother came by yesterday. Jonah waited. Made an offer, Alden went on. $50 for the claim, cash on the counter. He'd settle your account here as part of it. You could rent a room above the livery through winter. Hire out come spring. The figure hung in the air between them, enough to clear the debt. Enough to put walls of milled lumber and a stove that did not leak between his family and the coming cold. Enough to keep Thomas warm until April. Alden folded his hands on the counter. There was no cruelty in his manner. He was a merchant, and to a merchant the arithmetic was plain. A man could recover from a lost claim. Recovering from a hard winter with a small child was less certain. Jonah listened until Alden had finished speaking. Then he shook his head once. No, Alden sighed and made a small note in the margin of his ledger. The pencil scratched across the paper. 2 men warming themselves at the stove near the back of the store exchanged a look that neither of them tried to hide. Before Jonah reached the door, Alden spoke again, more quietly this time. February changes a man's mind about a great many things. Outside, the wind carried a dusting of grit down the main street. Jonah tucked the length of stovepipe under one arm and started toward the wagon. Behind him, drifting through the doorway of the mercantile, came a voice pitched to Carrie. That pipe'll heat the sky before it heats a wall of hay. Laughter followed. Jonah kept walking. He climbed to the seat, set the stovepipe carefully beside him, and clucked the old horse into motion. The pipe rattled softly against the sideboard all the way home. Back at the claim, October gave way to November, and the cabin took its final shape. Cottonwood poles ran the length of the roof. Worn canvas covered the frame. A thin cap of sod pressed the canvas down against the wind. Inside, the revised plaster hardened without new cracks. Clara hung a wool blanket to divide the sleeping area from the main room, set the plank table against the west wall, and swept the earthen floor with a whisk of bound grass until it was as clean as a swept threshing floor. Jonah added one final piece to the wall beside the door. The cracked thermometer he had rescued from his father's tool shed years ago and kept for reasons he could no longer name. From the day he hung it, Ezra Marsh's leather almanac took on new work. Every morning and every evening, Jonah recorded the same handful of numbers. Outside temperature. Inside temperature. Wind direction. Fuel burned since the last entry. Condition of each wall by compass point. The entries began filling the almanac's blank back pages in Jonah's careful hand, one small column at a time. On the first hard cold night of the season, the prairie dropped to 18 degrees above zero. Jonah checked the thermometer beside the door before he stoked the stove for morning. 36 degrees inside, with no fire having burned since bedtime. 36 was not warm, 36 was survival. It was also 18 degrees higher than the world beyond the walls, achieved with nothing burning at all. Jonah recorded the numbers without ceremony. Clara looked over his shoulder as he wrote, and rested her hand briefly against the back of his neck. "Your father," she said, "would have liked that column." Jonah looked down at the almanac. His father's handwriting filled the front. His own now filled the back. He did not answer, but he did not need to. The first real windstorm arrived on a Thursday in mid-November. It came down out of the northwest with the confidence of something that had never lost a fight. Sagebrush laid flat. The canvas roof cover cracked and thumped. Ranger sprang to his feet inside the cabin and barked once at the north wall. Jonah heard the loose flap a heartbeat later. He pulled on his coat, grabbed a coil of rawhide, and stepped outside. The wind hit him like a hand against the chest. He climbed the low north side of the roof, worked a loose section of canvas back under its lath, and packed fresh clay into a narrow gap that had opened near the gable. By the time he came back through the door, his fingers had gone stiff to the second knuckle. Clara had already moved Thomas away from the north wall and set a low fire of cow chips and sage in the stove. The thermometer delivered its verdict at dusk. 12 degrees outside, 49 inside. The difference surprised even Jonah. Beyond the walls, the wind sounded loud enough to strip a barn of its shingles. Inside, it had softened to a distant, sustained murmur, no louder than a distant train. Beneath the day's earlier measurements, Jonah added 3 short lines to the almanac. North wall held. Roof edge loosened, repaired before dark. Interior held above 45, with 1 small fire. Thomas watched him finish writing. "Did the wind get in, Pa?" Jonah rested his palm against the plaster beside the stove. It was cool, but not cold. The air around them was neither. "Not enough to matter," he said. Outside, the prairie kept fighting. Inside, still air was quietly winning. Wendell rode out 3 days later. The visit had the shape of all his recent visits. He had come to see the failure with his own eyes. The low roofline earned a smirk. The uneven plaster along the west wall earned another. By the time he reached the door, the old nickname had returned to his mouth as easily as a hymn. "Quite the beggar's barn," he said, ducking beneath the lintel. Inside, something interrupted the performance. The air was warmer than the air he had left behind on horseback. Not comfortable, not impressive, simply warmer. Wendell noticed. He refused to admit it. "A pile of hay can fool a man for a week or two," he said, looking around the single room. "That doesn't make it a house." Jonah did not argue. The almanac sat open on the shelf beside the stove. Columns of small numbers ran down the newest page. Wendell glanced at it and glanced away. The blizzard came on the 14th of January, and it announced itself hours in advance to anyone who knew how to read the sky. Jonah Marsh watched the barometer he had borrowed from Otis Blackwell slide steadily through the morning. By noon, it had fallen further than he had ever seen a needle fall in a single day. The clouds thickened into the color of wet slate. The wind stopped entirely for the better part of an hour, which was the worst sign of all. It struck at 2 in the afternoon. Snow moved sideways instead of down, and the temperature collapsed from 20 above to 4 below in the space of 90 minutes. By dark, it stood at 19 below. By midnight, 28. Jonah worked methodically before it hit. He inspected the rawhide gasket around the door. He packed fresh clay into a hairline gap near the gable. He moved the fuel closer to the stove and checked the stovepipe joints twice. Clara wrapped Thomas in every blanket they owned and set water to warm on the range. Ranger took his position beside the door and did not leave it. The cabin absorbed the first blows and did not shudder. A frame house shakes when the wind hits it. Their walls did not shake. Their thickness spread each gust across the whole shell of the building, and the shell held. The thermometer beside the door read 51 degrees when the storm began. 6 hours in, 48. At midnight, 45. Well above the point where a child could die in his sleep. The first knock came near 10 o'clock. Otis Blackwell, his wife Miriam, and their small granddaughter stood in the doorway, wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. Their frame house still stood, but the wind had been slipping through its walls for hours, and the stove could not keep pace. Jonah stepped aside without a word. An hour later, Ranger barked again. Wendell Marsh stood on the other side of the door, with his wife and 2 children behind him, snow caked to his shoulders, and his lips gone bluish at the edges. The roof over his grain shed had collapsed under drifted snow. The frame house he had inherited could no longer be kept above freezing. For the first time in Jonah's memory, his brother did not know what to say. Jonah did not wait for him to find the words. He reached out, took hold of the front of Wendell's coat, and pulled him inside. The door shut behind them, and the storm went back into the darkness where it belonged. The blizzard blew for 2 more days. 9 people and 1 dog lived through it inside walls of moldy hay that a county's worth of good men had promised would fail. The stove burned steady. The thermometer never dropped below 42. Nobody suggested leaving. Nobody used the old nickname. When the wind finally quit on the 3rd morning, Otis Blackwell walked outside, laid his hand flat against the north wall, and stood there for a long time. "How much ash," he asked at last, "in your plaster?" It was the first technical question he had ever asked Jonah Marsh. Others followed through the spring, from other men, and Jonah answered every one of them. Wendell said very little before he rode home. Halfway across the yard he stopped and looked back at the cabin, and then he said, quietly enough that only Jonah heard, "Father would have known." If you found something worth carrying in this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more. Peace.